Good morning, everybody. Can I please request everybody to be seated so we can begin? And welcome back to the final day of March Meeting 2023, which convenes this year under the banner of the post-colonial constellation Art, Culture, Politics after 1960, and coincides with 30 years of Sharjah Biennial 15. Thank you for joining us here today. It's a great pleasure to be able to welcome our speakers who've joined us from far corners of the globe and to have you here in Sharjah. As per usual, I would like to start with a little housekeeping. All sessions will be English and simultaneous translation in Arabic is available. You can collect your translation headsets outside. Tea, coffee, and lunch will also be provided throughout the day. There's also a reading room corner and outside the hall on the left. Our first session today is a keynote titled Black Radicalism and the Archive, Inventories of Fire by Brent Edwards, Peng Family Professor of English and Comparative Literature, Columbia University. After Brent's keynote, there will be a brief audience Q&A. Please join me in giving him a warm welcome.
Good morning. I want to first thank Salah Hassan and the whole March Meeting team, Hur, Maria, Hessa, for such a warm welcome and for organizing behind the scenes such an important and major and complicated event. It's been an inspiring series of days, and I'm really pleased to be here. This talk is called Black Radicalism in the Archive, and it's part of a book of the same title. The basic stakes of the book, the proposal of the book overall, what I'm trying to do is to get us to think about archives not as static repositories of prior Black political radicalism, but about archiving, about archival practice as a key component of political radicalism. So documentation, classification, and preservation. And this, what I'm going to do today is not an overview, it's not kind of a survey sort of talk, it's really a case study sort of talk. So I'm taking you into the minutia of a particular case of archival practice. For those of you who were here yesterday, it's very much in dialogue with the archive panel yesterday morning, and I think I hadn't thought about it when Salah asked me, and I was thinking what I could do, but it actually seems to me it is very much about the overarching theme of the conference, thinking historically in the present. I can say more about that if you want me to. The Martinican poet, novelist, and theorist Edouard Glissant's magisterial 1981 Le Discours Entier, Caribbean Discourse, opens with a series of introductions, a disparate set of 11 short pieces that seem designed to lay out the terms for the overarching and continually maintained project elaborated across the occasional pieces selected and collected in the book. The titles of these introductory texts all commence with the phrase "à partir de," starting from, in a manner that implies that they should be read as a posteriori qualifications, an inventory of the book's points of departure, in other words, or of the facts on the ground, whether the landmarks in the solitary labor of the individual writer, Glissant's previous work, on the one hand, or the structural features of Antillean reality the volume attempts to survey on the other. Only 6 of the 11 points of departure in the French original are included in J. Michael Dash's English translation, Caribbean Discourse, and one of the ones left out is a short piece titled "À partir d'Acoma." You see it there, number 8 on the list. A reference to the journal Acoma that Glissant edited in Fort-de-France, Martinique, from 1971 to 1973. The text of "À partir d'Acoma" is taken from the opening pages of the first issue of the journal. But intriguingly, it's only an excerpt of a prefatory editorial statement that leaves out the circumstances of the original intervention. In Le Discours Entier, there's Acoma, the first issue. In Le Discours Entier, it comes across as a broad stroke theoretical injunction about the stakes of analytical research. The will to go deeper, la volonté d'approfondissement, only bears fruit when it is kept in lucidity from being taken as some sufficient reality. But in Akoma 1, in the first issue, the injunction is yoked to the content of the issue, limited to the specific moment of its intervention. There's a little phrase added there. The will to go deeper demonstrated here, ici manifesté, the sentence specifies in its original context. When one turns the page, it's even more surprising to realize that the preface highlights the will to go deeper not in the issue as a whole, but in a particular example. The editorial statement initially served as the preface to the very first text in the journal, the translation of an open letter written in Fort-de-France in December 1969 by none other than the African-American activist and intellectual James Forman, who had served as the executive secretary and subsequently director of International Affairs Commission of SNCC, as well as the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Black Panther Party, for a crucial, albeit tumultuous period in 1968. James Forman had come to Martinique on a research project. He planned to write a biography of the great theorist of anti-colonialism, Frantz Fanon. Here are the first two paragraphs of the editorial preface to the original in its original journal form. So this is the preface to Forman's open letter. This is Glissant writing in his guise as the editor of Akoma. Jacques Forman, speaking of Fanon, a black American activist seeking his truth, among others, in the memory of the theoretician of decolonization. A letter from Fort-de-France through which the preoccupations, the desires, the determination of a New York intellectual are formulated. We've chosen to put Akoma under this double sign, whatever distances there may be between our condition as Martinicans and the situation of American Negroes, and whatever position Forman himself may hold within the black movement in the US, and whatever distances there may be between Fanon's meteoric thought, anchored in irreversible action, and our preoccupation as researchers who are still cut off from all action and yet still careful not to be deceived by words. The will to go deeper demonstrated here, etc., that sentence that is taken up in Caribbean Discourse. Aside from the humorous and perhaps symptomatic Gallicization of James Forman's first name, Jacques Forman is rechristened, what's striking here is the gesture of placing Akoma itself under the double sign of this case study, which is seemingly meant its inherent comparativism. One radicalism defining itself by tracing the contours of another, an African-American intellectual and activist seeking his own answers by turning to the model of a Francophone Caribbean intellectual and activist. Whatever the accomplishment of an intellectual inquiry, according to the Akoma preface, going deeper can only be fully realized in the extreme of an action. That is, the task of archival excavation, implied by the imperative of going deeper, only has meaning in relationship to the urgency of political intervention, emblematized by Fanon's radicalism. I'll return to Forman's biography of Fanon in a minute, but I want to emphasize that what I've attempted to sketch out so far, vertiginous as it may be, is one way of understanding what it means to read a book archivally. That is, to allow one's reading to be informed by the range of intertext avowed by the book as its constitutive sources, even to the point that the coherence of the book as a unit starts to unravel. Presenting us with an inventory of its points of departure and an imperative to go deeper, the book, Edouard Glissant's Le Discours Entier, Caribbean Discourse, in other words, invites us to take a detour into those sources, as though precisely to admit that their other reverberations, cross-current fictions, attractions, and aversions cannot be either exhausted or fully integrated into its fabric. This is perhaps first of all an avowal that literature is a social medium. As the science fiction novelist Samuel Delany puts it bluntly, quote, "A book is written by many people, even if there's only one name on the cover." But it's equally important that the archival gesture is self-reflexive, that Le Discours Entier, Glissant's book, opens by proffering an inventory of its sources, only invites us to recall that these sources sometimes do the same, as when the journal Akoma is inaugurated under the double sign of Forman's previous research. The question that remains then is how to make sense of the relation between such an archival self-reflexivity and the practice of political radicalism, the link between going deeper through an intellectual inquiry and the extreme of an action in society. My use of the term inventory should recall Antonio Gramsci's well-known formulation from the notebooks he kept as a political prisoner in Italy in the early 1930s. Here's the famous quote: "The starting point of critical elaboration is the consciousness of what one really is, and is knowing thyself as a product of the historical process to date, which has deposited in you an infinity of traces without leaving an inventory." Edward Said famously pointed out that the translation of this passage in the 1971 edition of Gramsci's prison notebooks inexplicably omitted the next sentence from the Italian original, which is critical. "Such an inventory must therefore be made at the onset," Gramsci prescribes. Gramsci's formula is often taken as a figurative description of critical practice, which must be predicated on an understanding of the self as historically contingent entity, formed through the deposit of an infinity of traces. But what if we understand the Gramsci task, the task that he goes on to impose, such an inventory must therefore be made at the outset, as an archival imperative? The only way to make such an inventory, in other words, would be to collect, preserve, and classify those traces, not in an internal reverie, but in some externalized form. It could be 47 pictures taped to the wall of a prison cell. It could be a bundle of letters tied up with string. It could be a briefcase stuffed with a jumble, a recommendation letter, a link from a prisoner's leg chain, a paper doll, the pieces of a shattered piggy bank, a pair of sunglasses. But the traces have to be gathered and kept. It's worth recalling the definition of an inventory in library science. T.R. Schellenberg, in his field codifying 1965, The Management of Archives, notes that, quote, "A record inventory is, as its name implies, a stock-taking of records with a twofold purpose: to provide a preliminary analysis of an archival group and to provide an initial or provisional finding aid." In other words, an inventory is something that a processing archivist compiles when she first encounters a collection, an initial listing of its contents. It's not just a mechanical exercise, however, noting down the titles and dates or documents or artifacts one after the other. The inventory is indispensable when the processing archivist goes on to make the final finding aid, that is, the guide to the collection that will subsequently serve as an interface for users, because it's the archivist's first attempt to get a sense of the quasi-autonomous registers of intelligibility that are already in the materials in the collection, the traces of the ways the individual organization that created it used them, and in using them, conceptualized their significance and interrelation. In other words, the inventory is where the processing archivist first encounters the issue of provenance, the ways a collection came to function for the individual or organization that assembled it. According to Schellenberg, making an inventory is therefore not at all a passive process, but instead a kind of discipline. "Today is Sunday in Fort-de-France," writes James Forman in the December 1969 open letter published in the first issue of Akoma under the title 10 Years Plan. "We are living in the center of town and all is quiet. Today is the one day that the workers have for rest, a respite from the grueling pace of day-to-day living in the Antilles. The heat and the humidity are sometimes formidable, but the courage and endurance of my ancestors swells up in me and gives me the fortitude to keep on pushing, trying to learn the Martinican reality, its history and contemporary status. This is just one aspect of the work I'm trying to do here, for as you know, I've long been working on the biography of Fanon. The other two aspects is to interview people who knew Fanon and to discuss his thought with some important thinkers of Martinique." So that's just the first paragraph of this document in the first issue of Glissant's journal. Forman was a prolific writer, perhaps best known for his 1972 autobiography, The Making of Black Revolutionaries, an invaluable document of the civil rights era, in part because of the way Forman assembled the book, not only as a personal narrative, but more expansively as a compendium of a wide range of other voices captured in various forms of documentation: letters, diary entries, oral histories, prison journals, newspapers, leaflets, speech transcripts, segregationist propaganda, SNCC organizational records, and sworn affidavits of uncharged detainees in an Albany, Georgia jail in 1961 that Forman took down on paper towels. But I'll focus here on the Fanon book, a project that Foreman went to extraordinary lengths to research but did not ever succeed in bringing to fruition. While it's something of a commonplace to note the unparalleled influence of Frantz Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth, which was the first of his books to be translated into English in 1963, on the major Black radical activists of the Black Power period, it remains the case that the complexities of that impact have never been properly charted. Foreman's work may be the least well-known because it was never published, but it may be the most remarkable. He commenced work on the project in earnest in April 1968, when he traveled to Sweden and France as a representative both of SNCC and of the Black Panthers. In Paris, he made the acquaintance of Frantz Fanon's older brother, Joby, who agreed to be interviewed, and put Foreman in touch with others, including Marcel Monville, who had served in World War II with Fanon, and the poet and politician Aimé Césaire, who had taught Fanon in high school in Martinique. After taping a number of interviews in Paris, Foreman spent 10 days in Algeria, where he was hosted by Fanon's widow, Josie, accompanied by Julia Wright Hervé, the daughter of Richard Wright. Julia Wright Hervé had translated a collection of Foreman's writings into French the previous year. Foreman was able to interview not only Josie Fanon, but also many of Fanon's former colleagues at the Blida-Joinville Psychiatric Hospital, where Fanon had been stationed from 1953 to 1956. In the multiple book proposals that Foreman drafted over the next 3 years, one consistent feature was his intention, quote, to write a book primarily directed at an audience of young blacks in the US who need to know more about Fanon as a person in order to understand better his ideas. At the end of the summer of 1968, this is one of his outlines, Foreman conceived of the book project for what he called the life and thought of Frantz Fanon as a collective endeavor, and attempted to draft, his term, interesting word to use in the Vietnam era, his colleagues and friends as contributors. While sections written by Foreman would provide historical background and analysis of Fanon's work, as well as a discussion of his work's relevance to ongoing liberation struggles throughout the African diaspora, Foreman also planned to include chapters by the eminent sociologist St. Clair Drake, Fanon and African Realities, a chapter by Josie Fanon herself, Fanon and Africa Today, the Puerto Rican nationalist Ana Livia Cordero, about the Puerto Rican struggle, and an unspecified Chicano activist. In late August 1968, after a crisis of nervous exhaustion, predicated in part by a complicated clash of personalities between the Panthers and SNCC, who had been in dialogue about a formal alliance, Foreman had been spending a number of weeks in Vega Baja, Puerto Rico, recuperating at the home of Ana Livia Cordero, who was a physician as well as a political activist, not to mention the former wife of the novelist Julian Mayfield. The circumstances were by no means lavish, but the tranquility of what Foreman described in letters as a forced vacation with his wife Constancia Dinky Romilly and their 14-month-old son, James Foreman Jr., to take a break from the demands of organizational work and reconsider his priorities. He didn't stop writing, however. What's fascinating is that Foreman proceeded by constructing an inventory in multiple media. He began making tape recordings of reflections on his childhood and upbringing, material he would later use in writing his autobiography. Simultaneously, Foreman, who had started reading the diary of Ernesto Che Guevara, decided to keep a diary. And this is a letter where he talks about keeping a diary. It's also meant to be included in the diary. As you see at the top, it says Foreman's diary. I was swimming in the Caribbean when the idea flashed through my mind that I should go home and start my own diary, and that many insights are lost when political leaders do not keep records. That is one of the reasons for dictating something on my life. I realize what a loss it is not to have Fanon's thoughts on his own life. Undoubtedly, had he lived, he would have done this. Whether or not Fanon would have eventually gotten around to writing an autobiography, the decision proved crucial for Foreman's work. The pragmatic utility of journal keeping is easy enough to comprehend. On the simplest level, the discipline of written recall offers the benefits of putting events into a kind of order so that you can see their significance more easily. For Foreman, the diary provided a tool for self-reflection, knowing thyself, to return to Gramsci, because they forced him to transcribe both events and, above all, his thoughts and emotions as close to the onrushing current of experience as possible. It's not a good habit, he believed, quote, to allow too much time to elapse between an action and its written description. But Forman also thought that diary writing and the particular discipline of inventory work in the sense I've described was a key component of political radicalism. Every serious revolutionary should keep a diary, he argued. This was a message Forman impressed on everyone around him. The SNCC records are especially rich because Forman was such a stickler for keeping detailed and ordered archives when he served as executive secretary. And his correspondence was filled with admonitions to other activists. I criticized Anna Livia for not writing last night, he confesses in one diary entry in Puerto Rico. She too claims that she doesn't have the time, but I'll keep pressuring her and Samuel and others to avoid this mistake. In early 1970, again in Puerto Rico, he found time to write a long letter to Mike Hamlin, a labor organizer with the League of Revolutionary Black Workers in Detroit. Quote, I plead with you to try and obtain as many back copies of your newspaper and other written material as soon as possible. I know that you're busy, but you owe it to history to start keeping adequate records. Forman's diaristic practice took on a number of intriguing facets. Almost as soon as he started writing diary entries every day, Forman also started to compose them as letters, as though he could not bear to be divorced from the sociology of radical camaraderie in order to sequester himself in the echo chamber of a personal journal. This creates an effect of overhearing, since he sends his letters not only to the given correspondent, but also to other collaborators. Thus, Forman sends carbon copies of his letters to St. Clair Drake and Dan Aldridge to Julian Mayfield. At times, he adds annotations or addenda, as when he mails the typewritten August 29th entry to Mayfield with the handwritten note scribbled at the bottom. Hey man, how you doing? Did you get what you need, my letter to you and diary entries? Faced with an outpouring of his own making, Forman found himself compelled to design what he termed in another diary entry cum letter, a new method of coding material, a relatively straightforward way of keeping track of documents when he was writing and mailing multiple items each day. In other words, he comes up with an inventory system, and you see his coding method there. The most important shift, however, is that Forman came to the decision that his diary entries contained such valuable observation and analysis that they would have to be included in the Fanon book itself. Forman arrived in Fort-de-France in Martinique on December 17, 1969. As he explains in a diary entry a few days later, he was determined, quote, to write essays that profoundly describe the reality of colonialism here as I perceive it. Even as he considered the ways his journal writing could inform the biographical project, Forman recognized that there was something about the undertaking that would exceed the needs of a book on Fanon. He met some people who had known Fanon personally and interviewed others who were able to give him a sense of the island in the years when Fanon was growing up there. But he was also talking to almost everyone he met. This is one of his tape inventories of his recorded interviews. You see he talked to Edouard Glissant, among others, political party members, dock workers, maids, hotel owners, librarians, historians, school children, about contemporary Martinique, about what it felt like at the moment he was there, more than 8 years after Fanon's death. Even before he made the trip to Martinique, Forman mused, I'm wondering how this diary can be effectively used, for it's more than a diary of events. It's one of moods, of attitudes, a stripping bare of my inner thoughts and placing them in writing. It's myself on paper. By the end of his time in Fort-de-France, he decided that while he'd draw on the diary in making a case for the continued relevance of Fanon to the biography, he had enough material for a separate book. To be titled Black Skin, White Mask, 1970, the book would be more of an update to Fanon's 1952 masterwork than an analysis of it, framing Forman's diary entries in a comparative discussion, as he put it, of the current reality of the island. He imagined the book as an interweaving of his diary entries and the dozens of interviews he was recorded. So the interview transcript would be next to the diary entry of a given day. His writing often strains to give a sense of the pervasiveness of colonialism, the degree to which it was taken for granted as an immutable feature of the landscape. Some of the most effective moments in the diary may be the smallest, the moments when Forman doesn't strive for grandiose summation, but instead details the most mundane elements of his days, washing his clothes in the hotel room bidet, attending a boisterous pro-autonomy demonstration organized by the Parti Progressiste Martiniquais, the political party founded by Césaire in 1958, whereas he listens to an eloquent speaker dressed in a Tanzanian-looking gabardine shirt and brown pants. Forman notices a young girl carrying, quote, a pot of shit through the crowd to empty it, behind the platform. She apparently was coming from a house or store without a flushing toilet. Where he chats in other sections with the twice-married hotel maid from St. Lucia, who spent 10 years in the US and comes every day around noon to make his bed and clean his room on the top floor. Foreman writes that I've always paid close attention to my dreams, and some of the threatening undercurrent in the atmosphere of the island during his stay makes its way into his habitual recounting of the dreams he's having while in Fort-de-France. Some of them are by turns deadpan and phantasmagoric. This is just the beginning of one. I spent a rather fretful night, waking up first after having a dream in which I remember I was at first trapped by a police officer, and the people around me thought that he could be trusted. After my capture, I recall having jumped on his head, taken his gun, and demolished him until blood was running from his head. It seemed that the final shape of the head took the form of a fish head. Fish is a standard Creole dish, and Anna, the owner of the hotel, cooks it with extremely hot substances. My stomach has been giving me some problems since my arrival, and this may account for the symbol of the fish head. A little bit of self-analysis. Compiling an inventory involves a procedure of retrospection, figuring out what one really is by delving into the ways the self has been shaped by the historical process to date, in Gramsci's terms, requires something like an archaeological mindset as one sifts through the traces the past has deposited. Likewise, when Schellenberg declares that the processing archivist must acquire knowledge of records through a discipline grappling with their origin, structure, and content, he clearly means that making an inventory necessitates a historiographic orientation. It's perhaps unsurprising, then, that arguably the major thread running through Foreman's diaries is an anxiety over the relation between the retrospective posture of diary writing and the synchronic imperative of political action. Of course, Glissant's editorial preface is consumed with the same binary between going deeper and irreversible action. The anxiety is rooted in the seeming paradox that to write is not to act. To extract oneself from the social dynamics of any situation in order to reflect on its significance in writing seems inherently to mean to abdicate on participation and intervention. In a few extreme cases, including Samuel Delaney's experiments with what he called simultaneous journaling and the French anthropologist Michel Léris's travel journals, diarists have attempted a solution to this dilemma by attempting to write everything, to capture experience in such exhaustive detail on the page that the life and the writing would somehow coincide. At times, Foreman's diaries evince a similar desire. As he phrases it, history writing by activists is something that should occur simultaneously as the action proceeds, I think. The difference is that for Foreman, that's less a question of the relation between writing and experience in general, and more an issue of the relationship between writing and political activism in particular. Most of the writers who've experimented with exhaustive journal keeping do so in the keen awareness that it's a technical impossibility as well as an exercise in fantasy. In Delaney's journals, or perhaps most relevant here in comparison to Foreman, in John Edgar Wideman's two books about Fanon and Martinique, the result of this awareness is that silence becomes a theme in the work, as the diarist continually confronts the inability of the practice of writing to record the full breadth of even the smallest moment. In contrast, Foreman retains a striking and perhaps naive commitment to the notion that writing could somehow accompany and match the ephemerality of action. In late August 1968, noting that he senses a pattern emerging from the writing of the diary and that his entries are always a reflection of the day's events after they have occurred, he decides to start using yellow legal pads in which he's determined to write things as they happen. And he adds facetiously, assuming that pattern, P-A-T-T-E-N-E, is meant to read patent, but revealingly, in a note to self, all in capitals, there toward the bottom, no instamatic recording of thoughts, must invent a system for patent. Instant coffee, instant thought recording. At other times, he seems to invest in the equally fanciful notion that writing can serve as a technique, not to record everything, but to record only the precise material it's necessary to preserve. To write a diary, one must compress reality and inscribe only the essentials. There's a certain hubris native to the inventory, a presumption of authority, a claim to the right to intuit the registers of intelligibility in a deposit of traces. Quote, I know I am a maker of the historical process as well as one of its objects, end of quote. Foreman writes in the summer of 1969, quote, "If there is one man who's been crucial to the history of the 60s, I am that man. That is why my autobiography is important, and the handwritten volumes are even more important." In 2009, I had the opportunity to interview Amiri Baraka about the relationship between its impulse to archive on the one hand and its political activism on the other, between the seemingly demure, patient work of keeping records and the seemingly loud, precipitous exigencies of social change through a revolution that for Baraka came to be associated with the primordial figure for a destructive force as inexorable as its cathartic, fire. Why, I asked him, do his papers, which are archived at Columbia now, not only document his own career as a writer with drafts, correspondence, contract reviews, and other such material, but also an astonishing range of the collective movements and institutions he participated in, from mayoral election campaigns in Newark to the African Free School, from the Congress of African People to the 1972 Gary Convention. What drove him to collect so much material on the history and activities of the Black radical organizations he had moved through? His answer is worth hearing in full. This is Baraka.
I was thinking about that, documenting. I mean, we acquired one-year-old cameras from CBS during the Congress of African People. We had up-to-date cameras. We did interviews with everybody. Every demonstration we had, every panel we had, we put on tape. Why? So that we wouldn't have to do the same thing you have to do to find out what Du Bois did, or what anybody in the public eye did. So we have 176 videotapes in that collection too, that are made of every speaker, whether they spoke on music or politics, literature, every demonstration that we had. And it was my own sense. I read once about Du Bois when he was being tried as an agent of a foreign power. I don't know if you all know that. We've got a play coming out about that I wrote. And the guy who defended him was the Italian communist Vito Marcantonio. So they were trying to say that it was Du Bois who had organized this group that, was anti-nuclear, what it was. They were against the bomb, that's all it was. But in those days, being against the bomb was like, being a terrible person. So they said he was an agent of a foreign power. So Marcantonio says, Dr. Du Bois, do you think you have a copy of the letter? The letter that the guy sent him, asking him to join this group, right? It wasn't, he didn't start the group. The guy asked him to join the group. He said, do you have a copy of that letter? He said, wouldn't the original be better? And he goes to his file cabinet and pulls the letter out. And that was a precedent. So then you're looking in there and he's got his 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade report cards in there. And the woman asked him, so, well, doctor, what did you think, you were going to be famous? He said, it occurred to me. You know what I mean?
Baraka starts out by speaking of the impulse to archive as a collective compulsion, we, a drive that seems to have something to do with the sociality of activism. The improvised anecdote seems to serve to deflect the hubris of inventory building onto Du Bois rather than Baraka himself, and yet at the same time as he associates himself with Du Bois through the tale, Baraka thereby projects himself into a tradition of great black male archivist intellectuals. If the impulse to document initially seems to be motivated by a commitment to the historical record of black radicalism and even a generational consciousness, so that you wouldn't have to do the same thing that we did to find out what Du Bois did, the anecdote takes it in a different direction, fame, or more precisely exposes the fact that hubris cannot be extricated from that impulse. The drive to know oneself through an inventory of traces cannot be reduced to celebrity, but it cannot be separated from a drive to celebrity either. When James Forman was introduced to Frantz Fanon's then 78-year-old mother, he requested the opportunity to record a formal interview with her. They made an appointment for the morning of Saturday, December 20th, 1969. Foreman had enlisted the help of one of Fanon's nephews, a young man who, as it turned out, was also named Franz Fanon in memory of his uncle. In advance of the session, Foreman prepared an introductory text to present to her. It will be a historical document, he predicted, explaining the book project as well as his own background and previous work. The nephew, Foreman calls him in the diary, young Franz, translated the 4-page introduction into French and read it aloud to his grandmother. In the 10 years plan letter published in Acoma, in Glissant's journal, Foreman writes that, quote, "My interview with Mrs. Fanon impressed once again upon me the absolute need for historical documentation and record keeping, not in respect to his own research, but instead because he was moved by the realization that Fanon's mother had tried to keep her own archive of materials related to her son. She suggested that Foreman look at the autopsy reports that Fanon had filed when he returned to Martinique briefly before being posted to Algeria. And she told her visitor that, quote, she had a package of letters that she'd been keeping from the time her son went into the army until his death, letters that unfortunately had been misplaced by another son, Félix. A storehouse of information has been lost, Foreman laments. In the 10 years plan letter, he recounts their hour-and-a-half meeting in detail. As I recorded her words, Foreman writes to his friends, quote, a great sense of history swelled up in me, a sense that I was participating in a moment of enormous value, a moment that I wanted to share with you. Young Franz served as interpreter. Foreman had studied some French, but as he wrote, I can speak the language, but not well enough to transcribe tapes. In writing in his diary about his other interviews in Martinique, Foreman admits that he cannot always keep up in French with everything his informants are telling him in the moment. The language factor even seems to be preserved in the notes he was taking on his yellow pad, not a diary entry composed after the event this time, but notes he was scribbling while he was in the room with Mrs. Fanon. One page simply has the French translation of an instruction to speak loudly and clearly for the recording, parler en haute voix pour enregistrer, perhaps a necessary mnemonic for someone whose mastery of the language was shaky. On another sheet, Foreman is already reflecting on the significance of the moment even before the interview begins. 8 a.m. I am in the home of Mrs. Fanon. Young Franz is reading the introduction. The atmosphere, the history of the moment rises up in the atmosphere. There's the hubris, as expected, a sense of occasion. We are gathering information that is historically invaluable. But with at least one other fragmented note, an entire page of the yellow pad, empty aside from 4 words, something very different seems to be happening. She cries, très dur. Here's another trace being inventoried. Not Foreman's conviction of the history of the moment this time, but instead his reaction, surreptitious, compulsive, to the evidence of a mother's grief at the memory of her deceased son. I still have not acquired the habit of keeping the diary in an action situation Foreman had written a few months earlier. One way to describe what's recorded in notes like the ones he was scribbling in Mrs. Fanon's dining room, though, is as a redefinition of the word action, where that word refers less to a cliched figure of political engagement, the protest march, the stump speech, the picket line, the sit-in, and more to the moment when writing does succeed in transcribing the right now of an ethical response that is also, of course, nothing other than a political response. Frantz Fanon famously described black skin, white masks as, quote, a mirror with a progressive infrastructure. And at moments like these, Foreman's unfinished Fanon project approaches a similar achievement in an act of self-inventorying that shifts as it goes along. Fanon also wrote that the anti-colonial struggle was not solely a matter of fighting for the freedom of one's people, but also and especially a task of continually reasserting, quote, the full measure of man, la dimension de l'homme, the human dimension, through historical work by going deeper. Fanon writes, quote, you must retrace the paths of history, the history of man damned by other men, and elicit, make possible the encounter between your people and others. In Foreman's spare inventory, the shift is indexed by the shift in languages, from English to French, from his language to hers. She cries, très dur. Here's the trace of their meeting, their encounter, caught in language. A modest achievement, we might say. but it's not an easy thing to compile an inventory of the advancing progress of a fire while standing in the flames. Thank you. I know that I went over. I was watching the terrifying red numbers.
Thank you. My name's Terry Smith. I deeply appreciated what you put in front of us, and particularly where you took us to a point of origin, of recovering historical knowledge. It was wonderful. But going back to the start of your talk, when you drew attention to the inventory and the finding aid, and then showed us how, in effect, Foreman created his own finding aids as he gathered the materials for his inventory. So my question is, given the fact that most inventories, patents, and most finding aids in most archives and libraries have a long tradition, and they're deeply European in many structures, and they pretend to objectivity, what would a black finding aid be like?
That's a great question, and in a sense, that's what the whole project is about, is what does it mean to take seriously and theorize black archival practice, specifically black mode of archiving, rather than the inheritance or the application, the kind of perfunctory, mechanical application of a standard derived from elsewhere. Obviously, someone like Foreman is not a trained librarian, but think about it. Arturo Schomburg doesn't start out as a trained librarian. Arturo Schomburg gathers his collection not as an employee of the New York Public Library, but as an employee in the mailroom of corporate office collecting stuff on his own. And he comes up with his own systems for documenting, classifying, and preserving that material. And this kind of sui generis extramural vernacular or lay approaches to archival practice is exactly what I'm trying to trace. So Foreman is not, he has a sense of what classification methods are, but he's not just importing and imposing a method from elsewhere. One other comment just in terms of what the project is trying to do. What I'm trying to do is to think seriously in the terms of archival science as a field. Sometimes we, the humanities and social sciences, talk about the archive. As John Taine said yesterday, there's not one archive. There are archives, and the plurality and the contestatory nature of those archives, that they don't necessarily follow the same plan, is crucial. But there's also archive science. We read Foucault, we read Derrida, we read Stoller, we read Hartman, but we don't read Archivaria or archive science or American archivists. So I'm trying to take the terms that emerge in the field and think about them as theoretical terms, not to impose the top-down methodologies from the field, but to think about these vernacular approaches to the key terms of the field, such as inventory, finding aid, provenance, original order, fond. I am distinguishing here between inventory and finding aid. A finding aid, if you've been to an archive, you don't think about it as something that's written. When I teach in an archive, I assign my students to read a finding aid. A finding aid has a poetics to it. It has literary qualities, and there are all sorts of epistemological decisions and political decisions that are being made in the way you organize material. Do you put this in this series or in that series? It affects the way, it sets up the way the researcher can access the material and ask certain kinds of questions. So we shouldn't think of the finding aid as a kind of transparent or objective document by any means, and librarians and processing archivists don't. The inventory is something different. The inventory is kind of a proto-finding aid. The inventory, when you're processing a collection, is the first thing you do. You're just trying to get a sense of what's there. So you write down the contents. And when I teach in the archives at Columbia, one of the assignments I give to my students is to inventory a box of an unprocessed collection, just to figure out what's in it and to start putting things, okay, there The first time I taught the class I've been teaching for more than a decade now was right when that was Baraka in my class that I played, right when those papers came to Columbia. And I had them each just choose a box and inventory it. There was sort of a list, but it was not very clear. And we could talk about some interesting things. Why did he have 24 copies of that photo of Maya Angelou? And why were those Maya Angelou photos next to a copy of Nina Simone's birth certificate? And why was there an empty beer can in the same box? Baraka came to my class, he said, there's no beer cans in my boxes. But there was. So you can ask interesting questions when you think about a person or an entity or an organization's own mode of organization, their own practice of making sense of what counts and what doesn't. But an inventory is your first stab at that. Your first let's list what's here. And a finding aid is down the road in terms of archival science. Sorry, I used your question as an excuse to give you a little more. I know that I am very near the end of my time. Am I near the end of my time? You're cutting me off. You're giving me the hook. Thank you.